Meersman. He is currently the director of the St. Joseph River Basin Commission, and he's got a long history here in the St. Joe River. And talking about the St. Joe, I'm promoting the St. Joe River Watershed. So we welcome you to Andrews University. We welcome you to the Berry County Math Science Center. This is our grade 10 chemistry class, and as I was telling you earlier, we started out this year with looking at the periodic table. So they may be familiar with some of the toxic metals and stuff like that that could be of concern to the environment. So Matt is going to tell us some of his educational background. One of the things that you may want to know about him is that he grew up right down the road, South Bend, not too far. And I had a question for you guys. Do you know why South Bend has its name? Anybody?
It's the southernmost end of the St. Joseph River.
Okay.
That's right.
Okay. All right. All right. One more question. 3 rivers. Somebody else.
There are 3 rivers.
What are the names? The names.
Rocky, Portage, and South St. Joe.
Okay. You guys have been studying for this. Very good. So with that, Max, take over from here.
Thanks,
Thank you for
Desmond.
coming. Okay.
Thank you all. Good morning, everybody. I want to start off by talking to you a little bit before I actually get into the river and what I do for work. I want to talk to you about why I do this kind of work. My passion for protecting or restoring the water comes from the love of being on it or in it. So Desmond said I grew up in South Bend. My family had a little lake cottage just a couple counties over in Branch County, Michigan. So I grew up going to the lake all the time and water skiing and canoeing and kayaking, and I ended up sort of discovering this crazy little obscure sport of marathon canoe racing. And so for the last 15 years, every summer I go all over Michigan, up into Canada, doing canoe races. And I really find that it's a way to connect what I do for work with my personal life. You know, when I go canoeing, I don't want to be on a dirty river, so it kind of connects everything up. Every year I do this big race up in northern Michigan where about 100 teams start on this tiny little river. In order to get us all started, we have to start on the street in town and run with our canoes all the way to the river, jump on, and we paddle for 120 miles to Lake Huron. So this year I finished in just under 15 hours. It was in the top 5. I was pretty excited about it. This was us leaving town, paddling out. About, 2,000 people come out to watch the start of the race. It's a lot of fun. The race actually starts at 9 o'clock at night. So we race all through the night. You can see we got like little lights mounted to the front of our boat that we'll turn on. I'm about to hit the side of the bank over there, a little bit out of control. But anyway, that's a lot of fun, and that's kind of what connects me to wanting to protect and improve the river. So this entity that I'm involved with now, I say entity, technically it's an agency of the state of Indiana. It's called the St. Joe River Basin Commission. And I want to tell you a little bit about why it was created before. I mean, I don't know that I need to get into so much to what it is, but I think just understanding why it was created will kind of give you a sense of what it's for. Back in the 1980s, there was a lot of energy around the St. Joe River being a destination for fishing. Not just the river itself, but a lot of the lakes that drain to the river were called out as being really good for bass fishing. And then, as you guys probably know, being in this area, maybe not, but definitely Berrien Springs locals will know that the salmon and the steelhead are these fish that they feed and live a lot of their life out in Lake Michigan, but then they come up the river to spawn and lay their eggs for the next year. And they tend, back in the day, they would really stack up at the Berrien Springs Dam. And even to this day, you'll find a lot of guys fishing right below the dam for these big salmon and steelhead, really big fish. Well, in the 80s, there was an effort by Michigan and Indiana to come together along with the power company to build fish ladders at the dam at Berrien Springs, Buchanan, Niles, South Bend, Mishawaka, that would allow these fish to go all the way up to Elkhart County in Indiana, really. And that was largely part of an effort to not just improve habitat and wildlife, but for recreation, tourism, and economic development. You know, the cities of South Bend and Mishawaka, along with those Michigan cities that I mentioned, were like, hey, this is great. People are going to come, they're going to fish, they're going to spend money in our town, they're going to stay here. So there was a lot of excitement around promoting the river as this destination. Well, right about that same time, the health department and the environmental agencies realized that the St. Joe River wasn't meeting water quality standards for body contact. There was too much bacteria in it, like E. coli and pathogens, that technically you weren't supposed to be fully in the water swimming or you might get sick. And so there was obviously a lot of concern, like how are we going to promote this river as this great thing to come and spend your time on, be fishing, you know, get your hands all in it when we're supposed to be telling people that it's too dirty and, you know, you need to be careful with it. So the local leaders down on the Indiana side of the line said, well, we've got a model in the state of Indiana for creating these river basin commissions. We'll create one for the St. Joe with a focus on water quality. So that's how the entity was created. What it is it's basically all 6 counties in northern Indiana that drain to the St. Joe River have representatives on the commission, and it's trying to coordinate efforts between all the different communities. And I'm going to touch on a little bit later today the different ways that we publicly manage our water. But a lot of what I'm going to talk about is what private landowners maybe can do to have an impact on improving or protecting the river. So anyway, I got the job about 3 years ago to lead this agency, trying to bring people together across northern Indiana. The mission of the entity includes Michigan, and I'll show you some maps of what we're talking about. But the funding for my program and the governance of it, the people that are in charge of it are all on the Indiana side of the line. So there's we're trying to work together with Michigan, but the money and the people that I report to are all on the Indiana side of the line right now. So one of the things that the commission, I believe, was created to do was to answer the question of how's the river doing? Is it getting better or is it getting worse? I see that as one of our responsibilities to try and be able to answer that, whether it be for a local government or for private citizens. I think there's 2 different ways to look at it. You know, we can talk in terms of the bacteria and E. coli that I mentioned to begin with, but there's a whole lot of other problems. You know, Desmond mentioned some of these sort of heavy metals or toxics that we might find in the river. That's one problem. Ecology, you know, is there more fish than there used to be? And then the big one, which is what I'm trying to illustrate with this picture here. This was last year, 2018, when we had some major flooding all throughout the St. Joe River Basin. You know, we had crazy flooding. So that's a component of what we're dealing with. It's not just water quality, but also water quantity and how much water is moving through the system. So I want to get you guys all thinking about the St. Joe River and any of these tributaries. You know, Pipestone Creek comes through here. The Dowagiac River is just down the road, and Niles. We got all kinds. You know, you mentioned the 3 rivers of 3 rivers. Think about all those rivers, but I want you to think about them in terms of 3 different time periods. So let this photo kind of illustrate today. This is now, okay?
I got a question. So the foaming that we are seeing there, is that natural? Is that good? Is that something?
It's not necessarily good, but the foam we see in the river isn't always bad either. In this particular case, what it's often direct result of is there's a dam right here, just off the photo. So the water has come pouring over that dam and it gets churned up. So any kind of organics that are in the water kind of get churned up and sudsed up. Now this time of year there's probably a lot of stuff that's coming through wastewater treatment plants that can create that foaming action. So it's not all necessarily natural, but I know on the Dowagiac River, which is typically, you know, if we haven't had any rain for a little while, the Dowagiac's really clean. It's groundwater fed, really clear water. And even on that river where log jams are, we'll have these big piles of foam. People are like, oh, that's nasty. But it's really just organics. It's organic matter that's in the water.
Okay.
Good question, though. We get a lot of questions about, should I be scared of that foam? Okay, so So I want you to think about the river 3 different time periods. This one sort of representing today or now. This one representing sort of early 1800s industrialization. This one's actually the Chicago River. I've been meaning to I got a picture of the mouth of the St. Joe and Benton Harbor that looks really similar to this, around the same time period. So industrialization's going on. Think of the big smokestacks, all that kind of stuff. And then let's go one step even further back before Europeans arrived here, when the Pokagon Band of the Potawatomi was primary people living around here. Now, thinking about those 3 time periods, I want you to answer 2 different questions for me. For one, between this time period when the Pokagons were the dominant people here and this one, do you think the water quality, raise your hand if you think the water quality got better when we went from when it was just the natives to this? Anybody think the water quality got better? Okay. How about when we went from here, to there? So from 1800s to today, does anybody think the water quality got better? Yeah, a few people. Yeah, it did. It did. That's the right answer. And I'm going to talk about why. But before that, we're going to talk about something else that's related. So if we go back to here, how about from Native American time to turn of the century, how about flooding? Raise your hand if you think flooding was, if there was less flooding from here to here. Less flooding. Raise your hand, okay. And then how about from here to there? Even less flooding. So we think about the water quality and the chemicals of pollution that we got. We say it was good, it got bad, and then it's gotten better now. When we talk about flooding, some of us are saying it was bad, it got better, and it got even better. Does anybody think that flooding got worse from the first step to the second? Some people, yeah. And how about from the second to the third? Who believes flooding is as bad as it's ever been today? Okay. Just me. Then about 3 or 4. All right. That happens to be, it's as bad now as we've ever seen it. And it's kind of wild, and why I bring that up, and it is less obvious. I know less people think about that, but I want to find out from you guys. So for some of you who thought flooding maybe had gotten a little better, what do you think that's about? Yeah.
I just figured with our new technology, more dams.
Yeah, dams, because in some parts of the country, dams are used as a flood control device. In southern Indiana, we have some of those dams. But in order for dams to work like that, you got to drain them out before you get all the rain. You got to build in capacity in that reservoir so that when you get the rain, you can fill it up. Up here where we're at in the St. Joe Basin, our dams weren't built for that purpose, so they keep water in them all year round. They're built for recreation or power generation. So that's a good, and also, I think along those same lines, and you mentioned it at first, we think about our technology. We've got all these stormwater pipes now, and we got rules around how when you develop a new miner store or something like that, you know that big pond they always have to build next to the parking lot, and it ends up being a bunch of trash and stuff in there? Well, that's to help with our stormwater issues. So you might think, well, now we're doing all this stuff. But the reason it's not has to do with what used to be there. So what used to be there was prairies and forests and all kinds of natural landscapes that are really good at soaking water into the ground. So although we've got a bunch of technology now, we're putting our water into pipes, storm sewers. You see the drains in the streets. They go into concrete pipes and all that stuff. But the water isn't able to soak into the ground. So more of our water than ever is moving sideways as runoff. It's moving over the land and going straight to the river or straight to a lake. So we got our flooding problems getting worse, even though our water quality has gotten a little better. And I want to talk about what's going on with that and why we've seen that change. So the first thing, this little graphic is to kind of talks about the 3 main things of the Clean Water Act. The Clean Water Act is the reason we turned the corner on water quality. So everybody raised their hand that the water must have gotten worse from when it was Native Americans to when industrialization happened. Everybody's like, yeah, no doubt. But what made it get better from industrialization till today? And that is largely due to the Clean Water Act. And what the Clean Water, it was a law that was passed federally, and what it said was, you can't just dump pollution into a river or a stream or a lake through a pipe as much as you want. Like, you can't just, used to be back in the day, and my grandma worked at Uniroyal, which was this big factory in Mishawaka. They made all kinds of rubber products. They also happened to be famous for these tennis shoes they made. They were called red ball bands, and they would dye the leather red. And she said the whole river would turn red when they were making a new batch of shoes because there was these discharge pipes that all the waste would just go straight to the river. And she said back then no one would go anywhere near the river as far as swimming or fishing. Like, you just didn't go there. And so what the Clean Water Act said was, you can't just discharge your waste from industrial processes, or if you're a community and you got sewer lines, you can't just pipe your sewers straight to the river and let all that stuff go. No, you got to get a permit, and we're going to test the water that's coming out of your pipe, and it's got to meet certain standards. So that law was passed back in the late 70s, early 80s, and that really changed water quality. We started to see big improvements. You guys are probably too young, but maybe someday you'll hear about, before the Clean Water Act, we had rivers in the Midwest. The famous one is the Cuyahoga River over in Cleveland that would catch fire periodically. There was so much pollution in it that like a spark would set the whole river on fire because there was that much pollution in the river. And everybody talked about how exciting it was to get into the late 80s and early 90s when people started to catch fish in the Cuyahoga River again and stuff. So we were able to turn the corner a lot with the passage of the Clean Water Act. How many people, so the graphic is, according to the Clean Water Act, we're supposed to be protecting all of our surface water, all of our lakes and rivers to be drinkable, swimmable, and fishable. That's what this is all about. That's what the Clean Water Act, the purpose of it was to try and protect all of our water to be drinkable, swimmable, and fishable. How many people think the St. Joe River is fishable right now? Yeah, I do too. Swimmable? Yeah, I do. Now, after heavy rains, there's some question about the bacteria that's in there. Yeah, I've never gotten sick. Now, how about drinkable? How many people think the St. Joe River is drinkable? Yeah, not happening. It's not even close. Because there's a whole bunch of people who don't even want to swim in it. So, what I want to talk about is the things that are keeping us from getting to be all three of those things are the same things that are making our flooding problems get worse year after year after year. Before I dive into that, though, I want to try and get at how we, and this is not just the St. Joe River Basin Commission, but any other group that's interested in this kind of stuff, how do we answer the question of how do we know? So I mentioned earlier, is the river getting better or is it getting worse? Is it drinkable, fishable? How do we know? This is where I want you to think of it in a few different ways. So the first one is what you guys are all working on. Kevin, do we go out there and take samples? Get a sample, take it back to the lab, run an analysis. What kind of toxics are in it? What kind of organics, biological stuff that's going on in there? Is there bacteria, E. coli? So chemistry is one way we know about this stuff. And the St. Joe River Basin Commission in the past has sponsored a fair amount of water sampling in this way. But there's some problems with using this to really understand the system. And the biggest one is, and it's not that these things can't be overcome, but the biggest one is that when you go out and you take a sample, it's a snapshot. It's what's going on right then. It's pretty easy to imagine how if 15 minutes later we get a big rainstorm and you were to go out there and grab a sample, you're going to get a very different result than what you got 15 minutes earlier before the rain happened. Now that may be real obvious. What's less obvious, you go out and grab a sample now, you take it back to the lab, you run the numbers, versus if 15 minutes later a farmer applied a bunch of manure to his field, you might get a different result if there's any runoff from that manure, or depending on what's going on at the wastewater treatment plant. So what I'm sort of getting at is that one of the issues with chemical analysis is that you have to do it continuously to be able to get a handle on, is it getting better or is it getting worse? Because it could be you just happened to grab it at the right time and it was really clean because we hadn't had any rain, no one had applied any fertilizer, so it's looking real good. you could just as likely the next week go out there and have a terrible sample because of the timing of those two things. At the very least, rainfall and land application of fertilizer can really throw things off. So chemical analysis can get really expensive and really labor intensive because you need to continually get it in order to really have a good sense. So we look at some other things. One of the things that's kind of one of the cheaper ways is just kind of sort of looking at the habitat, trying to, and this isn't going to tell you if there's any toxics in there necessarily, but this is looking at the corridor where the river runs through, or the lake, and sort of saying, what kind of habitat, little niches are there for living things to colonize? Is there clean gravel for fish to lay eggs on? Is there, soil left for plants to take root in? And some of this is just measuring erosion as it's taking place. There are some ways to quantify how things are doing just based on what the physical environment looks like. One of the ones that I get more excited about, because I think it's kind of meets us in the middle on a lot of these things as being somewhat cost effective, but also telling us a lot. And that is looking at the biology, looking at what's living in the water. And the nice thing about the biology is, and let's just talk about insects, because they're sampling fish in this picture, and that can tell us some cool things too. But one of the first things we look at is the insects. And what we know is there's a whole bunch of insects that are really tolerant of pollution. Like, they can live in really nasty water. And then there's a whole other class of insects that are really intolerant of pollution. And the water's got to be really clean in order for these insects to live. And there's a whole bunch of classes in between those that are somewhat intolerant, very tolerant, less tolerant, that kind of thing. So there's a spectrum of insects that can either handle pollution or they get killed by pollution real easy. So when you go out into the stream and you find bugs that only can live when it's a pretty clean stream, you know that over time the water's been clean. So maybe it's spiked up and had some nasties running through it at a couple different points, but overall it must be pretty clean because you've got these bugs living in there that wouldn't make it if it was too dirty. So that's one of the ways that we try to get at that answer of, is it getting better, is it getting worse? Well, what kind of things are we finding living in the water? And if we're finding less tolerant things living in only less tolerant things, we know things are bad. But if we find really intolerant, really sensitive species living there, hey, that's a pretty good sign that the water's doing pretty good. So biology is another way. One of the last ways I'll mention is also kind of, it's more of a physics thing. It's hydrology, or looking at the flow. How much water is moving through our system? This is a picture of a stream gauge. The U.S. Geological Survey, they maintain gauges all over the country. You can go onto a website and click on these gauges. There's probably 7 or 8 of them on the St. Joe River, and find out exactly how much water is moving through the river at any point. So after your rainstorm, you pull up a graph and it'll show you how the river goes up when we get a lot of rain and it's going real down in the summer, that kind of thing. How this can tell you about how the river's doing besides just knowing if we're being flooded or not, because obviously if there's a whole bunch of water going through the river, we're probably, it's getting high. And at some point it's going to show you, there's actually marks on the graph when we reach flood stage, and you could have an idea at your home when it gets to this spot, I need to get out of there because otherwise my road's going to be full and I need to get out before it gets to this level. So they tell you about that, but they can also tell you about the quality. Not directly, but indirectly, it can tell you about the quality of the river in terms of how quickly the river shoots up after a rain event. So if we think about those 3 different time periods that I was talking about at the beginning, like we go back to pre-settlement, when it was Native Americans here primarily, if you were to get the kind of rainstorm that we got in February of 2018, back then, when all the land was still covered by forests, prairies, and wetlands, you would have seen that the graph that you pull up on the website, it would have went up. But it went up really slowly and over a long period of time and come back down. When you go and pull up the graph for what it looked like in 2018, it shot right up and it ran high for a little while, and then it comes back down pretty fast too. We call it flashiness, but it's how quickly the river responds to a big rainfall or snowmelt event. And when you see it responding quickly, like when it's jumping up after a rain, you know that there's not much water soaking into the ground. And when there's not much water soaking into the ground, it means it's running over the top and picking up all kinds of nasty stuff along the way that comes to the river, whether that's fertilizer, dog poop, salt that we put on the roads, all kinds of stuff that's sitting on the surface that we never meant to end up in the river, trash, whatever. When we get big rainfall, that's where that stuff's all going because it's running sideways instead of soaking into the ground like it used to. All right. I mentioned that our water quality isn't quite where we want it yet. We're far away from being drinkable in the St. Joe. I mentioned the Uniroyal factory in Mishawaka. That's what this is a picture of. And there's no question that at that time, actually prior to the Clean Water Act, big industrial outfalls or these pipes that come out of them, wastewater treatment plants, that kind of thing, that was the major thing impairing our water quality. So the question that I pose is that still the major thing that we should all be scared of and worried about when we're talking about our water quality? This picture is the wastewater treatment plant in South Bend, Indiana, so where I live. And so I paddle by this all the time. I mean, I'm on the river probably 4 or 5 days a week, paddling my canoe. And I go right by this thing, and I got, through my work, I've met a lot of the people that work at these I know the guy who runs the one in South Bend, and they tell me that the water coming out of this wastewater treatment plant they have to run analysis on it. They're doing the chemical work on this. They tell me that the water coming out of there is cleaner than the water that's in the river after it's all done through that process. Now, I'm assuming they're talking about bacteria and E. coli in particular. I would almost be certain that there's more nutrients in what's coming out of there than what's in the river. But the thing is, perception-wise, they may tell me that, but I'm telling you what, when I paddle by there, that's the last place I want to tip over. It's like, in my mind, that's still one of the big pollutants. It's nasty. It's water coming out of a big factory, or in this case, a sewage plant. Like, I don't want to be tipping over there. And the thing is, it's more of a perception thing, though, because if we run the analysis, we find out that that's not where most of our pollution is coming from. As I mentioned to you, according to the EPA, something like 60% of the pollution we have in our lakes and rivers now is coming from polluted runoff. So it's not coming from a pipe from a factory. It's not coming out of a sewage plant. It's just coming from all of our lands, whether that be residential, it runs down the street after an event. We got a whole bunch of agriculture around here. Like something close to 70% of the land that drains the St. Joe River is used for agriculture of some kind. Well, a lot of fertilizer being applied, animal manure. And even without any impact, one thing I want to impress upon you, just the soil itself, dirt itself can be a pollutant in the system. So you go up there and you till up the garden with the rototiller and you get it ready to plant, but before you got anything growing in your garden, we get a big rainstorm, it washes a lot of that dirt off. Well, that covers up fish habitat. Attached to all that dirt is a lot of nutrients. Those nutrients get into the water, it takes out the dissolved oxygen, the things that the living things in the water need to keep going. You kind of get suffocated. So just runoff that's dirty, even if it doesn't have toxics in it, can be a problem. And so when we start thinking about if runoff is the main thing, and I say runoff, I'm just talking about when we get water, whether that's snow or rainfall, and it moves sideways instead of soaking into the ground, that's what I'm talking about here. That's where most of our pollution's coming from, and that's also where our flooding issues are coming from. If you go back to pre-settlement, we didn't have flooding issues. And that was because the water was soaking in. So this is the common denominator here that we're trying to work on with all of our local governments to think about how can we reduce the amount of water that's running sideways and increase the amount of water that's soaking into the ground. And that's what a lot of what we're trying to do is. And what that gets at, well, this is not, this is what the result of big heavy rains picking up all that nasty stuff, and that is not what I want to be paddling on. I mentioned agriculture. It's not just our urban areas where there's pavement. Agricultural fields don't soak in water the way prairies did, the way forests do. So we get a ton of runoff from fields when we get big events. And it's not just what's coming over the top this picture, which you probably can't see real well, but there's these little pipes coming out. What those little pipes are, this is an important thing. I didn't understand growing up in the city myself, but a lot of our agricultural lands have what are called drain tiles buried in the field. And what these are is pipes with little holes in them, like perforated pipes that are buried maybe 2-3 feet underneath the surface of the field. It's subsurface drainage. It's a way to get water out of the field so that they can get on there and plant crops or get on there and harvest crops. It's a way to get water out so it's not too muddy or soggy to get on. Well, what's draining through those tiles is not just water, and even if it was just clean water, we're getting more water into these little ditches that are meant to drain water off, and when we get more water in them, you get erosion occurring on the banks of them. There also happens to be a lot of dissolved nutrients that come through those tiles as well, and even bacteria and E. coli can not only be transferred into them from manure application, but what we're starting to find now is that colonies of bacteria can kind of establish themselves right in the drain tile themselves and grow and live great little lives inside these drain tiles and be discharging E. coli and bacteria to the system along with that water. So we've got water coming over the top, we got water coming out of little pipes all over the landscape that's draining to the St. Joe River. So Desmond used this word watershed, and I've kind of, so far, I've tried to avoid using it, but now we're going to jump into that because I think it's a really important concept. If you believe me in what I'm saying, that in order to solve our water quality issues and to reduce flooding, we got to try and get more of the water soaking in and less of the water running off. What that points to is if you care about any body of water, be it a lake or a river or a stream, the creek that goes through your backyard, if you care about that body of water, you're not going to fix it if it's broken, or you're not going to protect it if it's already in good shape by just working in the river or just working in the stream, just being in the lake. So we get a lot of, a couple folks here from Waterloo. You got Paw Paw Lake right there, huge asset to the community. Well, there's a whole bunch of people that have invested a whole bunch of money around Paw Paw Lake. They really care about whether there's weeds growing in the lake, whether it's safe to swim in the lake. Well, you're not going to fix those problems just working in the lake. You got to look at the land that's draining to the lake, because that's where a lot of that's where our water's coming from, and the pollution and stuff that we're worried about, that's where it's coming from. So what we really want to do is think about the land that's draining to the body of water that we want to protect or restore or whatever our goals are. And so this idea of watershed management is, if you care about the water, you need to look at what's going on in the land. Well, where do we need to look at if we care about the St. Joe? Well, there's like 5,000 square miles of land that drain to the St. Joe River, and I'll show you a map of it in a little bit. But the idea is that for any pond or lake or stream, you could go out on the landscape and you could delineate, or you could draw on a map where the land is that drains to that pond versus where the land is that drains to your neighbor's pond. And theoretically, you could go to a spot in between your 2 yards with a bucket of water, and you could pour it this way, and you know it's going to drain to your neighbor's pond. If you pour it this way, you know it's going to your pond. The Continental Divide, you guys have heard of that, right? I mean, that's a real obvious one, where big mountains are creating this divide. Around here, our divides aren't going to be that extreme. We don't have that kind of topography. We don't have big mountains and stuff, but we do have some really significant watershed boundaries or continental divides very near here. If you're ever going from here in Marion Springs to Indianapolis, for example, and you're on 31, you go outside of South Bend when you're on 31, you'll see a sign that says Continental Divide. Now, you're not out west. This isn't the Continental Divide between Mississippi and the Pacific Ocean. This is the Continental Divide between the Great Lakes and the Mississippi River. Now I'm going to show you a map of what that divide that you're going through is. But a continental divide is essentially a watershed boundary. It's a boundary between one area of land that's going to one water body and another area of land that's going to another. So we'll start as pulled back as I can is thinking about the Great Lakes. So where we are here, we're on land that's draining to the Great Lakes, which is pretty obvious because we're super close. But you don't have to be that far away from the Great Lakes and be in land that's not draining to the Great Lakes. And there's a whole bunch of people over here in Wisconsin that are really upset about some laws that were made that said, if you don't drain to the Great Lakes, you can't take the water from the Great Lakes to drink. And I think it's Oshkosh, Wisconsin is like right there. They need that public water supply, but according to law, they can't have it because their land doesn't drain to the Great Lakes. So legally, politically, there's all kinds of issues around the connection between surface water and the land that's draining to it. But for our purposes, I'm focused on it and I'm thinking about it because I want to work with improving land management and how we use our land so that we can have cleaner water and less flooding. So first thing, that's inside that yellow line is all the land that's draining to the Great Lakes. If we go down a little further, we're in the Lake Michigan Basin. Inside the red line is all the land that's draining to Lake Michigan. Go a step further, and I went backwards. Sorry. Then we can break down what's draining to Lake Michigan into individual rivers that are coming into Lake Michigan. The Kalamazoo River is a big one that's just north of us here, but ours is the St. Joe here. And the St. Joe happens to be the third largest watershed draining to Lake Michigan. So over in Wisconsin, they got the Fox, and then everybody's heard of Grand Rapids. The Grand River is the largest area of land draining to Lake Michigan in the state of Michigan. Happens to be second biggest by just a little bit to the Fox. So now I'm going to zoom you into our watershed. So the St. Joe Basin. And the blue lines on there are all of our major rivers and streams. You mentioned 3 rivers right up in here. Portage, Rocky, and the St. Joe. There's 15 counties, so this is the other thing you see is county boundaries, and this is where, Desmond was asking me kind of about my work, and a lot of it is trying to bring together local governments. So we have 15 counties between Indiana and Michigan that drain to the St. Joe. That's a lot. Each one of those counties has a couple cities in it. Trying to coordinate the efforts of all these folks to say, hey, where we find something that's working good, the way a city's managing their stormwater or their wastewater, we want to try and work with another city to see if that isn't something that can work for them. A lot of coordination between local governments in the work that I do. This slide I just had to show you for fun. All the streams that are covered by red lines or lakes, these are all the places that I've paddled in the St. Joe in the last few years. So you can see that I get around. And part of that actually helps me build, establish some respect with all these people that I'm going to visit. And what I want to get at here is, if my job is to try and coordinate the efforts of local governments, so I'm going to go work with the folks responsible for all the agricultural ditches way over in Calhoun County, Michigan, and they know I'm from South Bend, Indiana, or if I was from St. Joe Benton Harbor. These are primarily rural issues. These are agricultural, farming issues. They're going to look at me and know that my office is in South Bend, and they're going to be like, what's this city guy going to tell me about what's going on in my county where we do mostly farming? What's he know about that? Well, one of the things that I found is by getting out there and spending time on all these different water bodies and being able to talk to them about Pigeon Creek or the Cicero Ditch or any of these named water bodies that are right there in their county, not just talking about the St. Joe River, but talking about some small stream that means something to them. And when I can speak from it from a place of experience, all of a sudden you start to build trust. And that's really what it comes down to in a lot of the work that I do. If people believe that you're out there trying to understand their situation, not just worried about what's going on in South Bend and, hey, we want you to clean up your act up here because all your pollution's coming down to my town. No, you want to be thinking what's in it for them and what can we do up there that's going to affect their problems and the things that they're dealing with. So I try to get around, plus I like paddling and it's fun, so it gives me an excuse to get on the water. Within the St. Joe, you can keep breaking it down. You can keep looking at all these different streams in the watershed. We mentioned the Rocky River and the Portage. You can see how much land is drained to either one of those. The biggest tributary to the St. Joe, through a single river is the Elkhart River. And you can see that one's entirely drained on the state of Indiana. This is the state line going through here. I do a lot of work in the Elkhart River. It's wish I had a picture in here of where the Elkhart River meets the St. Joe, because you can really see the color difference of the water that's coming out of the Elkhart. It looks like chocolate milk. And the
Wow.
water in the St. Joe's pretty clean.
I've seen that with the Three Rivers. You could
Yeah?
see the difference.
In which one of those do you remember was looking kind of dirty?
It was the St. Joe.
St. Joe compared to the
Yeah.
other two, I'm not surprised.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, if you were to see that St. Joe looks real clean compared to the water that's
Oh,
coming out of the
wow.
Elkhart. So the Elkhart's got a lot of problems. I spent a lot of time down there. The Dowagiac River is one that I mentioned earlier. A lot of groundwater contribution to it. So a lot of the water that you find in the Dowagiac River in the middle of the summer especially is coming into the river up from the ground. So springs that are seeping water into the river. And you could feel it. If you go to where the Dowagiac meets the St. Joe, you could stand where one foot's in the Dowagiac River and the other foot's in the St. Joe. They're probably 15 to 20 degrees different in temperature depending on what time of year they're there. So it's a really cool system, and because it's so close, I wanted to zoom us in and just show you a couple slides of the Dowagiac once you start zooming in a little bit. So this is all the land. This is would be Cass County here, Berrien County, and Van Buren County. The more it's zoomed in you get, the better sense of the land cover that's going on. You can tell where agricultural fields are versus where some of these natural lands still are, and that makes a big difference in what's going on. I'm going to show you a couple more maps with some data on them. So what this map is showing is Native American time. So prior to European settlement, what kind of land cover we had in the Dowagiac. And it turns out that a lot of it was wetland and forest with some pretty big chunks of prairie. The orange sort of area is prairie. The lighter green is our wetland, and then these would be our forested areas. Well, compare that to the land cover that we have now.
Wow.
That is not prairie anymore. Everything that's orange or yellow is agriculture. And what's left in green is what we have left in the way of natural land. So 100% natural land cover prior to settlement, and now not a whole lot. Although the Dowagiac, I'm using this example, it's actually one of the good ones. In some of our other watersheds, there's a whole lot less natural land cover than what you see here.
Where does the Dowagiac start? What's the headwaters? Is it a lake?
This is the village of Decatur right here.
Okay.
So the one of the main stems of the Dowagiac starts there in Decatur, but this is what's called Dowagiac Creek, which goes to the city of Dowagiac, and that starts over, I think it's called like Bunker Lake is over
Okay.
here.
So it starts from lakes. Because
Yes.
some of the creeks just kind of start from marshlands and
Yes,
stuff.
from seeps and stuff, but a lot of times it is small ponds or headwater lakes that are the top. In fact, in Decatur, there's a pretty good sized lake called Lake of the Woods. That's the
Okay.
start of the main stem of the Dowagiac.
Okay.
I want to get you one more map here to kind of help understand some of the changes. So what you see here in green is what's wetlands that are still on the landscape, and what you see in red is what used to be wetland and no longer is. So can anybody take a stab at what a wetland is? You hear that word, I'm sure, but do anybody know what a wetland is?
Just a place where the ground is generally full of water.
Yeah, saturated. That's pretty good. Yeah, I would say like a place where the water and the land meet, where it's saturated. One of the ways legally that they would determine where a wetland is they would look at the kind of plants that are growing there. And if you find plants that are like adapted to having their feet wet, they call them, if their roots are always wet, you can pretty much assume it's a wetland. They'll also look at the soil type. There's certain soils that are only present in wetlands, but yes. So, wetlands, I don't know what you guys all think about them, but when I was growing up, I kind of thought, well, those are great for frogs or turtles or something, but other than that, well, it's where the mosquitoes and the snakes are. Like, I don't want anything to do with them, really. They are great for wildlife, but why we care about it is they also act like sponges or filters out of the landscape. It's a place where water's stored after those big heavy rain events. The plants that live in wetlands are really good at taking nutrients out of the water and turning it into organic material.
Like the bulrushes.
Yes, exactly.
Those-
They will pull
Yep.
nutrients out of the water, and so they act like filters, really. The water that's coming out of a wetland is typically much cleaner than the water that's going in. So they perform a lot of, the fancy word is like ecosystem services, but they perform functions for us. Like they clean our water for us, and for a long time we didn't understand that, and for a long time our mission was, and we got sponsorship by the federal government, like you could get money if you were a landowner the federal government would give you money to go out there and dig a ditch through the wetland, or bury some of those drain tiles, those perforated pipes, bury that in the wetland to drain that thing so that we could turn it into some productive agricultural ground. So some of our best farm ground is what used to be wetland, and it was seen as part of making the land usable. Well, it did do that, but we lost a lot of functions along the way. And when we look at wetland loss, that's another way to sort of get a sense of how healthy a watershed is. If you've lost a lot of your wetlands, you know you're going to have trouble cleaning the water and storing the water. So water quality and flooding are probably going to get worse. This is just the whole St. Joe. You get a sense the wetland loss did not occur evenly between Indiana and Michigan. You see a whole lot more red in Indiana than you do in Michigan. I think that's probably something Indiana folks were really proud of for a long time, and now it's flipped.
Not
now
so much.
Michigan's really proud that they got all those wetlands left, because you'll find the streams up here on the Michigan side of the line are generally a lot healthier than the streams that we have in Indiana. So good job being slower at draining your wetlands. This, again, land cover for the whole watershed. You see a lot more agriculture on the Indiana side, but there's a lot of it everywhere. Okay, I'm running out of time, and that brings up this slide, which is, okay, you told us that we lost all these wetlands, we changed all this land cover, and so what are you saying? Like, do we just need to turn back the clock? Are we supposed to go back in time? How are we supposed to make our rivers any cleaner or prevent flooding if we've lost all the storage on the landscape and we want to feed ourselves with farming? As much as I would think it's kind of cool to go back in time, and for me, canoeing and paddling, I can still do that. I don't know how I feed myself, but that's not what I'm proposing exactly, or that's not what I would recommend to the local governments that I work with. What I am proposing is that we try to think about or manage the landscape in a way that it acts more like it used to. So we know that we're not going to take what was a wetland that had become an agricultural field and turn it back to a wetland in most cases. Although the same federal government agency that would have paid you to drain your wetland, now they will pay you to put a wetland back. So if you happen to own land that used to be a wetland and you want to turn it back into a wetland, I think that's great, and the federal government does too, so they'll give you some money to do that. But not a whole lot of farmers are snatching that money up. They're farmers and they want to farm. So short of turning it back into a wetland, there's a whole bunch of things that we can do on that ground to make it function more like it would have when it was a wetland. And I don't know that I will have time to get into some of those practices, but there's some really cool things that farmers in particular can do to manage their fields in a way that increases the amount of water that they can take in and reduces the amount of water that runs off the field. And the way that we try to approach this in working with a farmer is, short of any new regulation taking place, I don't go talking about how this is going to make the river cleaner. Now, if I know that they're a fisherman or they're really into hunting, maybe that's something that they may see as an advantage. But when I talk about relating to people and meeting them where they are, what we're talking about with a farmer, why would they want to do these different management techniques? There has to be some benefit for the farm. And so a lot of the things that we focus on are not just good for water quality or good for flood mitigation or preventing flooding, but they're also practices that can be good for the business, that can be good for the farm. If you think about the more water that we soak into the field, if we get a dry spell from July to August, they want that water near this, they want that water in the root zone at least. So, we try to think about some of these things in terms of how it might increase resiliency is a word that we use a lot. And that resiliency can be resistance to pests. A lot of times, some of these management practices can actually help the crop be more resistant to pests, but it can also be more drought resistance. You're building resilience for the extremes that we're seeing with our weather, where we have a ton of rain 1 month, and then for 2 months we might not get any. So there's ways we can do that, and when it comes to changing behavior, and this is a lot of what I've been speaking to you guys about, how do you get someone to change through regulation? I mentioned that the Clean Water Act was passed in the late 70s and 80s, made a big difference. There's still, you have private property rights, and there's a lot of things. If you're a farmer and you want to drain your land, you have the right to drain your land. You don't have to keep it as a wetland. If you want to drain it as a farmer, you can do that. Cities and towns are now beginning to see some regulation around their stormwater. So when you think about the land that's running over city streets and being collected in the storm drain, there's finally some regulation around what needs to be done with that as a city, but it's still not at the point where the pipes where they're being tested and they have to meet any kind of water quality standard. It's not that. They just need to show that they're sweeping their streets regularly, that there's some detention places or some detention ponds in place. But compliance or regulation is one way to go about changing behavior. You can say you have to, or you're going to get in trouble. You have to get a permit, that kind of thing. We do some work with that kind of stuff, but where I've had more experience is with voluntary changes in behavior, and that's where I mentioned to you thinking about what's in it for the landowner, or what's in it for you as a homeowner. Why would you want to change your behavior? And some of that goes around our perception of water and what we think of it. And this may not be obvious to you, but for a long time, water was seen as an enemy in a way. It was something that you wanted to get rid of. And in fact, a lot of our infrastructure, the pipes that are buried underneath our city streets and stuff, those were originally put in place to get that rainwater off of the landscape and get it to the river as quickly as we could. You know, the idea is with the ditches out in the agricultural lands, get that water off my field and get it to Lake Michigan as soon as we can get it there. We know there's a whole bunch of issues with getting it there, but for the time being, that was the goal. Water is the enemy. We got more than enough of it. Let's get it out of here. Well, you go to other places in the country, like out west in particular, water is a scarce resource. There's not a lot of it. And so what we want to try and do is shift people's thinking to think of water as a resource, and how can we hold on to more of it and store it. Not in a way that it's going to harm us, but in a way that it could benefit us. This is here, the city of Goshen sponsored a bunch of artists to go and do paintings where their storm drains are, just to try to get people thinking of those storm drains as connected to the creek, connected to the Elkhart River, because a lot of people are way more likely to flick a cigarette butt or pour some used oil down a storm drain if they think it's going to some place where it's going to be cleaned up and processed, versus if they really knew where that's going, it's going straight to the river. It's not going through a treatment plant in most cases. So if you can shift that thinking, sometimes you can affect change in behavior without any regulation, just through what people's incentive is. Desmond, I think I'm getting...
You can go ahead a few minutes.
Okay. This is a really cool experiment that we do with farmers to help get them on board with some of these changes without regulation, without doing it for the clean water in the river, but to do it for their farm. And what this is a rainfall simulator, and each one of these pans has its own collection system, and in each one of these pans it's the same soil type, but there's different vegetation in each one of them. In the middle one, there's absolutely no vegetation. So that'd be like you just went out and tilled the field, nothing's growing in there. These two is where there's still some mulch on top. There's nothing necessarily living in the way of new plant growth, but it's still got last year's crop residue on there, or maybe you put some mulch down or something like that. And then this one's got some little seedlings that are just started, and this one's got some what are called cover crops, where you plant grasses and legumes that are going to live all year round. This has, living vegetation, deep roots in it, and they run this rainfall simulator. So all 5 of those trays, there's 5 of them, get the same amount of rain on them, and anything that runs off of these gets collected in these buckets. And so right away, the big obvious thing is, oh man, when you don't have anything on there, it's really dirty compared to when you got something on there, the water's fairly clean. Well, that's great if you care about clean water. But where we get more traction, where we get more impact on the landowners, is when you take this little panel off right here, there's another bucket underneath there, same size. For any water that didn't run off, that soaked in, it's collected in a different bucket. Well, when you peel this white panel away, you see that the bucket underneath this one has got quite a bit of water in it. The buckets underneath this one and this one, there's like no water left in there. And so what that means is there's no water available in their field once the rain stops to grow the crop for the next 3 weeks. So helping people, because these are management practices. We would be trying to work with a farmer to change from conventional tillage to something like no-till or incorporating cover crops, which is technical jargon for different kinds of ways to farm. And anyway, there's a picture of, on the left side is a farmer that's using what we call conventional tillage, versus on the right side is what we call no-till, where you're leaving the debris from last year on the field and you're planting right into it rather than turning the soil over and then planting your corn crop. And what we find is there's a whole lot less runoff and a whole lot more infiltration when you do it this way versus when you do it that way.
Okay. So do you want to take some questions
Yes.
and stuff now? Okay. Questions?
Would it be less work to leave things on top too?
Yeah, so that's one of the ways we pitch it is it's you save fuel costs. You don't have to make as many passes with your tractor, and it's a lot less work to do it that way. Yes, that's right. Any other questions?
So I thought that the watershed maps were really interesting, how that line goes so close to Lake Michigan, but it's not.
Yeah.
So, like, is there just a natural, like, peak in the land there, and it just kind of felt like.
Exactly, but it's subtle. Like it's not. You don't see like a ridge like you would think you out west you would see or something. It's very subtle. Yeah. And I think it has to do with glaciation when the glaciers came
Yeah.
pushed it up just enough.
Yeah.
And on the back side it drops enough, and that thing is the Minnesota River or something. It ends up going to Mississippi, but just on the other side of that, it's low enough that it's going that way. Yeah.
So you're talking like about all that red dye in the water and
Yeah.
how harmful it was. So I know that Chicago turns the river green
Yeah.
for like a week
For St. Patrick's Day.
Yeah, every St.
Yeah.
Patrick's Day. How much does that affect the water?
They swear not at all. So what was and I would be inclined to think that it's probably safe. They have to get a permit to do that from the state environmental agency. And so the big difference is not so much the fact that we're turning it a color, but what is being used to turn it that color. It's kind of like, we in a whole bunch of the food we eat, there's all kinds of food coloring that has been determined to be safe for us. Whether it is or not, I don't know, but the fact is we've done a bunch of lab work to say, yeah, we think it's pretty safe. Well, the same thing for the dyes. And City of South Bend does that in this little East Race. It's part of the St. Joe River, but they do a similar St. Patrick's Day thing where they turn the river green, and there's always a bunch of people that call our office like, should they really be doing that? I don't know if this is good. Yeah, that's a good question.
So I'm wondering in terms of this picture up here, when they're planting the new crops, does that interfere with any of their equipment?
They have to use different equipment for that. So that's one of the hurdles, right? If you've been doing it this way for a long time, and some guy like me comes, oh, you should try it this way. Yeah, but they need different equipment. So what's cool is there are some, every county has what's called in Michigan they're called just conservation districts, but in Indiana they're called soil and water conservation districts. But they are places, in this case, where you can go and then if you were interested in it, there are programs through the federal government that will kind of help cost share, so reduce the cost of that to try and help people with this. But one of the things I think is important, and again, Desmond was asking about what I do, and a lot of it is building relationships and working with people. And one of the things, when I think about this, is being really honest with the person. Do you notice that the corn over here doesn't look as healthy or as big as the corn on the left side? That's a reality at this stage of the corn plant's life. And what is, I think, super important to understand is that farmers are social people. They go to the coffee shop and sit down and have coffee almost every morning with a bunch of other farmers. And if you're the farmer that's doing this, everybody's laughing at you because they think you're crazy. Look at your corn, it doesn't even look that good. Look at mine, it's looking really good. So there's a perception issue with this that can't be ignored, and we have to be honest about that. Now, all the tests show that by the time we get to September and October when we're harvesting, this is caught up. This is caught up, and in fact, in dry years, this will outperform the conventional tillage. You'll get more yield out of this side, but being honest about that is important.
What happens if it floods?
Like with that soil soaking in more and kill the plants?
No, I don't think you would get to that point now. Not from the impact this, I guess. Now, is it possible that this whole field could get flooded to where the plants would die? Yes, but in terms of this side having more trouble than that side, no, because the infiltration that's occurring is sending it into a deeper zone rather than just sitting on the top. And in fact, what you'll find a lot of times is there's more ponding or pooling, like the water will just sit on the top of this soil, versus over here it's more likely to actually start passing through. And once it passes through even a little bit, you get some oxygen in the root zone, and then they can survive. Whereas if it's just standing water on top, that's what'll kill it. Anybody else have any other questions?
Yeah, this is highly unlikely, but I'm wondering, because I know a lot of farmers have trouble with like using pesticides because a lot of animals will come and eat their plants.
Yeah.
Is there any change that happens in that difference?
There is, and in this case, it's not pesticides in terms of for insects, but one of the technologies that was developed in order to do farming this way is herbicide. You have to, back in the day, tillage, like going through and tilling up the field, wasn't just to like expose for air or to make the soil better. It was to kill the other plants that were living there so that you have a clean slate to plant your seed in. Well, over here, if you're not tilling it up to kill the weeds, you got to kill them some other way, and so that's where they'll use herbicide to kill the weeds. So there is some, hey, maybe this is good in the terms of the runoff is less and less soil is leaving, but we're using Roundup to kill. Are we doing one thing that's better but doing another thing that's worse is a good question, and there's still a lot, I don't know what to say, like the jury is still out on that. I don't think it's clear, some of the benefits, so it's a good question. Anybody else?
So, I have a question. Oh,
With all this water moving horizontally,
Yeah.
into certain bodies of water, it moves a lot of invasive species too, like
Yep.
algae and all that. But will it increase the chances of aquatic growth or algae blooms, like duckweed that's not that harmful to green algae?
Absolutely. I mean, it's more of a risk, but when it moves horizontally, it picks up more nutrients. And what we're trying to do is help people understand, whether it's farmers or residential landowners, is that you bought that. You bought those nutrients. You don't want them to leave your property. So what we're trying to do is not to come out as like the water police and say, don't give me your nutrients. We don't want them. You're going to get in trouble if you give them to me. But rather to work with people to say, you bought these things. You don't want to give them to me. Like, how can we help keep them on your field or keep them on your lawn? Because once they're in suspension and they're in the water, we're growing aquatic vegetation like crazy now. It's wild. And honestly, that's sort of nature's response to the increased nutrient loading. Like, it's like, hey, all right, we got a whole bunch of fuel here to grow a whole bunch of plants, so we're going to do that. And honestly, I kind of want to promote that, because as it grows that vegetation, it's taking nutrients out of the water column and turning it into plant material. It's just that it has unintended consequences then with drainage and then invasive. Desmond?
so I have a question. Do you predict then, based on, for example, like February last year?
Yeah.
Do you predict that we're going to be having more of those increased
Yes,
flooding?
but not for me personally. I have been to a lot of the, in our region, it's Purdue and Notre Dame that have this climate change research center, and they just put out their statewide climate report, and it is incredible. They did some modeling just on the St. Joe system, and they are showing that within the next 20 years, we're going to already be seeing those kind of events. And all the models, they run all these different models, but all of them are predicting increased annual rainfall overall. And what's wild about it is it's all going to be coming in the winter time. Winter and early spring. So we're going to have, they're predicting anyway, drier summers, but overall on the year, it's going to be wetter because the winter is when we're going to get a ton of rain. And the problem with that, like why this is really scary for water managers, is that wintertime and early spring, there's no vegetation living. When vegetation is living, it can take up some of the water. It can help with promoting infiltration. In the wintertime, vegetation's dead. So we have a lot of bare soil in a lot of places. It's kind of like the worst time because we can't hold on to the water as well in the winter. Even if you just think about the ground being frozen in the winter, it's not likely to take in water when it's more frozen. So
You have a link to that
The climate
That-
report?
yeah,
I
the
could
report?
share one, absolutely.
Sure, yeah, that would be really good.
Yeah, they've been making their way around to a lot of the kinds of climate leadership summit and some different
Okay.
look at giving the report, and it's university research that's
Okay.
it's
okay.
local to our area, which is
Right.
what's cool about it.
Yeah, we need to know that.
A couple more.
Do the like the leftover plants, like the vegetation from the previous year, as those decompose, would the farmer have to like not fertilize the soil as much?
Exactly. That's the idea, is that you're trapping them there, and what it feeds earthworms. Like it turns into food into earthworms, and then the waste from those earthworms becomes nutrients that the crop can use. So yes, theoretically, once you get that built into the system, you should have less need for new nutrient input.
So Dr. Maroon was talking about the rain, and there's been a lot of hurricanes in the recent years. Even though we're not near those, how does that affect like our water as like a byproduct?
Right. I don't know, other than like as we are seeing more and more of those, we also see more extreme events here, like the exact connection. I don't know. I heard someone like, we shouldn't talk about it as global warming anymore. It should be global weirding. The weather patterns are just getting like wackier. So it's not just more hurricanes, but more of these really intense rain events, and then we'll go for weeks without anything. So I don't know about the connection. I'm not sure, but I do know that everything they're predicting is for more rain in the winter and less rain in the summer.
Okay, we want to thank Mr. Meersman.
Okay,
Was there
one
another
more,
question?
one more.
Okay.
So with all that rain in the winter, do you more likely to snow then?
No, because if it was, that would be better, because when the snow falls, it melts slowly kind of and can infiltrate into the ground. But no, they're saying the temperatures are going to be warmer, so we're going to get there was a dramatic reduction. It's going to be something like over the next 20 years, I want to say it was 20 to 30% less of our precipitation will come as snowfall on this rain.
Wow.
And it does another thing too. When we're covered in snow, solar energy is reflected back out more. Whereas when it's not white on the ground and it's dark colored, it warms it up even more. So it's got some really wild consequences of it not coming in the form of snow. If it were coming in the form of snow, it wouldn't be so bad. We could hold on to it more. It's a good question.
Okay. Let's give Mr. Meersman a round of applause.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for
Thank you very
staying
much.
awake with me.
Thank you very much.